Welcome. I'm David Skeel, Chairman of the Oversight Board, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this public meeting of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico, which is being held, as the last few meetings have been, by video conference. As always, I'd like to ask everyone watching or participating in this video conference to cooperate, and in particular, to keep yourselves on mute during the video conference. Let me start out by doing a roll call to see if we have a quorum for the official business of the meeting, starting with Andrew Biggs.
Present.
Thank you. Justin Peterson.
Present.
Thank you. And I believe Betty Rosa will be a little bit later. Arthur Gonzalez.
Present.
Thank you. John Nixon.
Present.
Thank you. Antonio Medina.
Presente.
And our ex officio member, the governor of Puerto Rico, Pedro Pierluisi.
Present.
Thank you, Governor. Looks like we clearly have a quorum, and we can now call the meeting to order. As usual, I'd like to ask Mr. Jaime El Khoury, our general counsel, to act as secretary for the meeting if he is willing.
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaime. Thanks to all of you in attendance at this public meeting, which, as I just mentioned, is being held by video conference. And thank you to all who are watching the live stream of the meeting via the board's website. The website is www.oversightboard.pr.gov. Per usual, I'm pleased to say that the audio of the meeting on the webcast is available both in English and in a simultaneous Spanish translation, and it's also being translated into sign language or in sign language. If you log on to the English website, you'll get the English audio. If you log on to the Spanish website, you'll hear the simultaneous translation. As usual, the board will be handling the public's questions and comments through a form available on the board's website. If you go on the website and click that page, there'll be a form there you can fill out. If you include your name and any questions or comments, we'll answer them during the assigned time period for questions and comments at the end of the meeting. The public will have, from the time the meeting starts now until up to 15 minutes prior to the public comments period, to share any questions or comments on the form. As usual, we'll hopefully get to all of them during the meeting, but if not, if we're not able to get into any question or comment, we will post an answer on our website. And I see Dr. Betty Rosa has now joined us, so we have everybody for this meeting. The topics for today's meeting, we have 7 items on our agenda. First will be approval of the minutes of the last public meeting and of executive sessions of the board. Second is administrative matters. Third is an update from the executive director. Fourth is Section 204 of PROMESA reprogramming issues. Fifth is the Commonwealth Certified Fiscal Plan structural reform implementation, or a structural reform implementation update. 6 is the public comment period. And then finally, if there are any other matters, we'll take them up at the very end of the meeting. So the first order of business is to approve the minutes of our last public meeting, which was held on February 26, 2021. The draft of the proposed minutes is included in the meeting materials, which are attached to the board packet as Appendix A. The second set of minutes to be approved are for a series of executive sessions the board held. They were on February 28, March 5, March 7, March 14, and March 19. Those are also included in the meeting materials. They're attached to the packet as Appendix B. So the meetings from the last public meeting and then a series of executive sessions. Are there any questions or comments about any of these minutes? Seeing none, can I have a motion for approval of the minutes?
I move to approve the minutes of the public meeting from February 26th and the minutes of the executive sessions held on the 28th, March 5th, March 7th, March 14th, and March 19th.
Thank you,
I'll
John.
second that.
Thank you, John. As usual, I will take a voice vote, starting with all in favor, then any opposed, then any abstentions. So all in favor of approving these minutes, please say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion therefore carries. Next topic on our agenda is administrative matters. Would anybody like to make the administrative motion?
Mr. Chair, I would like to make the following motion. Resolved, between the adjournment of this meeting and the opening of the board's next public meeting, the board may consider in executive session any and all matters it is authorized to consider under PROMESA, including first, any certification determinations authorized by PROMESA, including certification determinations under Section 206 of PROMESA. Second, any submissions or authorizations authorized by PROMESA. And third, any filings authorized under Title III of PROMESA. In each case, they're set forth as part of the vote to convene such executive session. The board may also act by unanimous written consent between meetings in accordance with the bylaws, with such consent to include consent by electronic transmission.
Thank you, Andrew. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Justin. Once again, I'll take a voice vote, starting with all in favor. Please say yes.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? So that motion carries as well. We have one other matter, and that is unanimous written consents. Can I have a motion to approve the unanimous written consents that the board has adopted since our last meeting?
Make that motion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, John. Do I have a second?
Yeah, I'll second.
Thank you, Antonio. Once again, I will take a voice vote. Will all in favor, please say yes.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? That motion carries as well. The next item on our agenda is the update from our Executive Director, Natalie Jaresko. Natalie?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For over a year, Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans have suffered from the COVID-19 pandemic together with everyone else across the world. We have suffered the loss of family and friends to the pandemic. We have suffered job losses. We've suffered closed businesses. We've suffered lost education time in our schools. And in response, the federal government has announced various COVID relief packages aimed at helping those in need and providing fiscal stimulus to the suffering economy. I'd like to discuss what Puerto Rico's residents and businesses, as well as the government, have received and can expect to receive going forward. The federal government has announced various COVID relief packages over the past year and a half, which we summarize into three, namely the CARES Act, the CRRSA Act, or the Coronavirus Responses and Relief Support Appropriation Act, and the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARP, totaling an estimated on a federal level $5.7 trillion. We estimate that Puerto Rico's share of these pieces of legislation to date is some $45 billion, from which individuals, businesses, and government will benefit to help deal with the impact of COVID-19 on the island. The most recent relief package, signed into law on March 11th, 2021, is the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan Act, or ARP. We estimate that Puerto Rico's share of the ARP is $19.9 billion. So let me walk through with you how we read the legislation and its effect on Puerto Rico. There are various funding initiatives in the ARP that Puerto Rico will benefit from. I'm just going to name a couple. Number one, there are the $1,400 stimulus checks that the residents of Puerto Rico will receive. That's the stimulus rebates, number one. Number two, I point you to the state and other government funding. Of this state and other government funding, 950 million will be going to the municipalities, above and beyond what you see, number two, 3.259 billion for the government of Puerto Rico. Taken together, it's over 4.1 billion to government entities on the island. Number four is $3.8 billion going to the education sector. And that education sector includes K through 12 and higher education. Number five, what you see is the extension of the $600 per week unemployment benefits until September 2021. And number six, really critical for Puerto Rico, are two individual tax incentives. First, expansion of the child tax credit, which has an estimated impact of $1.5 billion in fiscal year 22, assuming 100% take-up rate, meaning everyone participates that's eligible. And it changes the threshold from 3 children to 1, making more people eligible for that child tax credit. It also increases the credit to $3,000 per child in fiscal year 22. This is a multi-year extension of the child tax credit, and the impact gets reduced over time as the credit declines through fiscal year 23. The second important tax credit is expansion of the earned income tax credit for Puerto Ricans. The maximum benefit to Puerto Rico under this legislation is $600 million, assuming that Puerto Rico, in its own EITC program, adopts significant expansions. It includes $1 million to educate people about the expanded program, and the legislature and government need to take action. We've just this morning sent a letter to the government suggesting some ways that the existing Puerto Rico EITC could be expanded to maximize access to the federal EITC that has now become available to Puerto Rico. And number 7 on this page, very important for the island, is an expansion of the Nutritional Assistance Program, NAP, of $953 million. As with other COVID relief funds that we'll talk about, the board's estimates are the maximum that would be available to Puerto Rico. It's then up to the residents in some cases, the businesses in some cases, and the government to actually claim, spend the monies as eligible under the law. In some cases, these estimates will get adjusted before being incorporated into our fiscal plan, because we can't assume 100% application. Just a specific thing on the ARP, this new legislation. The state and local aid provided under the ARP has permitted and prohibited uses of the funds, eligibility. The most noteworthy of these is that compared to the CARES Act legislation, this time these funds are permitted to be used to offset lost revenue due to COVID. US Treasury is still expected to release detailed guidance for the states and localities to follow when determining permitted use of the funds, like it did previously for the CARES Act. If we look at the CARES Act, so not the ARP, but the first set of legislation almost a year ago, the largest allocations have already been dispersed in Puerto Rico, namely the unemployment insurance, the small business support, your PPP program, and the $1,200 stimulus checks to every resident qualifying. The total that we estimate available from the CARES Act for Puerto Rico is $15.2 billion, of which we estimate that about 2.8 still remains potentially available to be taken up by residents, government, and business. One of the larger categories in the estimated remaining column in the middle of the page that you see is education. And what you will, I am certain that the governor will agree, see much higher disbursements now that the U.S. Education Department recently announced that it would grant Puerto Rico immediate access to those federal education funds, including this CARES Act, as well as other federal education programs. Of this CARES Act 15.2 billion, remember that 2.2 billion in corona relief funds was provided to the Commonwealth government itself And on this page, on this slide, what you see is the government's decision as to how to utilize that 2.2 billion in accordance with the CARES Act. Of this 2.2 billion, AFAF reports that 517 million remains to be spent, invested into the island. And the deadline for dispersing these funds is December 31st of this year. If you all recall, in, I believe, December of 2020, as part of the omnibus spending bill, the administration passed with Congress the CRRSA, or Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. So this is the middle piece. Key programs here, again, extension of the PPP, or Paycheck Protection Plan, as well as the Economic Injury Disaster Loan advances, very important for the business sector on the island. The $600 stimulus checks that were allowed and distributed based on the CRRSA, number 2, here you see. The third important element of this legislation was the extension of unemployment insurance at $300 per week. The fourth, there were grants again to education, including K through 12 and higher education. And the fifth element here that I'll just point out is that there was an increase of some 590 million for the nutrition assistance program. So this assistance provides relief to businesses, families, municipalities. The federal government has, in essence, tried to target its assistance to every part of the economy and the residents that have been suffering over the last year, year and a half as a result of the pandemic. It also provides an enormous fiscal stimulus because these monies are being spent to a large degree on the island. It's also now an opportunity for the government to invest further in essential services like education and public health with these funds. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Natalie. Are there any questions or comments from anyone on the board? I don't see any questions or comments. So thank you again, Natalie. And we'll move to our next agenda item, which is Section 204C, reapportionments and reprogramming. And I believe Janorli Maldonado will be doing that presentation. Welcome, Janorli.
Thank you, Chairman Skill. Good morning, everyone. So I would like to highlight the following reapportionments that are included in this presentation. The request number 2 on this list, the Office of Socioeconomic and Community Development, is requesting a prior year fund release in the amount of $2.7 million of funds assigned by the Municipal Improvement Fund to execute improvements to urban and rural zones, housing improvements, and other construction work. Given the use of the funds, it's for capital expenditure projects. The recommendation is to approve the request. Request number 3, the Puerto Rico Labor Relations Board is requesting a budget increase in the amount of $50,000 for payroll needs. The source of funds is a one-time payment from the Ports Authority. Based on the projected spending, the agency has room within its current budget allocation to cover the payroll request, with the reapportionment of funds from the facilities cost concept. Thus, the recommendation is for the agency to recognize the revenue, but deny the request to increase their authority to spend. Request number 5, the Redevelopment Authority of Naval Station Roosevelt Roads is requesting to use its CapEx budget to cover a loan payment to USDA Rural Development for improvement to their drinking water system. The recommendation is to approve the request, but with a different source of funds. Instead of using the CapEx budget, the recommendation is to authorize the agency to access its SRF cash balances that are available. Next slide, please. The request number 9, the Puerto Rico Infrastructure Financing Authority is requesting a fund release in the amount of $12.8 million until June 30th, 2022 for the construction of an elevated bridge over La Muda intersection in the municipality of Guaynabo. The funds were appropriated through a joint resolution in 2016 for that same purpose. The project completed the design phase and it has not been initiated due to the earthquakes and the pandemic. The authority expects that the construction company will complete the project in 420 days. The recommendation is to approve the fund release requested. The contract for the construction has been awarded and the project will generate approximately 294 jobs because of the project. Request number 11, the Puerto Rico Integrated Transit Authority is requesting an interagency transfer from the Public Housing Administration in the amount of $1,000,084 to pay off current and prior year debts for lease payments owed to the Local Redevelopment Authority of Roosevelt Roads. The recommendation is to approve the request as the source of funds has been identified by the agency. Next page, please. Lastly, request number 14, the Department of Education is requesting to reprogram $46.3 million of funds that were previously authorized back in April of 2020 for the purchase and installation of trailers for temporary schools in the municipalities of Peñuelas, Guánica, and Guayanilla. The proposals received for this project reflected much higher prices than anticipated and longer timelines. The government decided to undertake the school module project that will take place in 10 out of 14 South municipalities within the disaster zone, impacting 38 schools with 8,900 students. The recommendation is to approve the reprogramming request. Thank you. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Janorli. Are there any questions or comments from the board about the reprogramming recommendations? I don't see any questions or comments. So with that, can somebody make a motion to approve the recommendations?
Move to approve the recommendations.
Thank you, Justin. Will somebody second that motion?
I'll second.
Thank you, Antonio. Once again, I'll conduct a voice vote of the board, starting with all in favor. All in favor, please say yes.
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 Any opposed? Say no. Any abstentions? The motion and the reprogrammings therefore carry. The next item on the agenda is an update on the implementation of the structural reforms in the fiscal plan. And I believe that will be given by Natalie Jaresco, as well as Ricardo Fuentes, the Oversight Board economist, Lizzie Rosso, the Ease of Doing Business Manager, and once again, Janorli Maldonado, who is Director of Commonwealth Budget and Fiscal Plans. So I'll turn it over to Natalie.
Thank you, Chairman. Ricardo, can you get us started?
Yes. Thank you, Chairman Skeel, and thank you, Ms. Jaresco. So PROMESA gives the Oversight Board the mandate to achieve fiscal responsibility with pro-growth reforms and renewed access to capital markets. And it is with this objective in mind that the Certified Fiscal Plan includes 5 key basic required structural reforms. Now, this is aligned with the consensus in the economic literature, which highlights that Puerto Rico's economic issues are structural and not cyclical in nature. Only reforms such as these can enable Puerto Rico to be competitive, attract and maintain investments, and ensure the creation of high-quality jobs. The government can create, through its public policy, the conditions that will make Puerto Rico a place where people can do business, raise families, visit, and enjoy. As Ms. Jaresco described earlier, Puerto Rico will receive substantial federal transfers, but without making needed changes, these funds may not result in long-term economic sustainability. Certainly, much more could and should be done to foster long-term economic development, but these reforms are the necessary foundation for restoring economic growth to the island. They are at the core of the potential for economic development. The specific reforms required in this roadmap to growth include the following. The human capital and welfare reform. Puerto Rico is not only the poorest US jurisdiction, but also has one of the lowest labor participation rates in the world. To address this, the government needs to ensure the general population is fully aware and educated on the benefits of the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, or Crédito por Trabajo, as it is known in Spanish, such that people can take it into account when determining whether to seek employment in the formal economy. It also includes implementing a work or volunteer requirement in the nutritional assistance program and revamping workforce development programs to ensure they are modernized. And this also includes the objective of removing barriers to employment, such as access to childcare and transportation. Workforce development has become even more urgent given the labor market dislocations that the pandemic has caused. The K-12 education reform has the objective of improving the quality of public education to ensure students are positioned to succeed in all schools across the island, so they can be successful and competitive on a global level post-graduation. Student outcomes and proficiency levels in Puerto Rico have been shown to be much lower than in the US and much lower than those of our traditional competitors such as Singapore or Ireland. The power sector or energy reform has the objective of ensuring reliability and affordability of energy for families and businesses. The unreliability of electricity in Puerto Rico not only impacts the quality of life of residents, but is also a significant cost to businesses on the island, who, for example, need to invest in generators. Next is the ease of doing business reform. In the World Bank Ease of Doing Business report, Puerto Rico's ranking has plummeted from 22nd in 2006 to 65th in 2020. And this highlights how behind we are in improving processes related to permitting, registering property, and paying taxes. Similarly, the government should eliminate outdated and inefficient on-island freight regulations, which increase transportation costs that are ultimately passed down to the consumers. And finally, infrastructure reform. Infrastructure quality is much lower than in the US. For example, the percentage of roads in good conditions is 11% in major highways and 1% in smaller traffic arteries. This is significantly below the US average of 81%. And once again, not only impacts quality of life of residents, but also doing business in Puerto Rico. Based on the economic impact similar reforms have had in other jurisdictions, the fiscal plan incorporates upticks to the GNP forecast. In other words, the fiscal plan projections take into account the positive impact these reforms would have on the economy. The 2020 Certified Fiscal Plan assumes the cumulative impact of these reforms by fiscal year 49 would be a 0.88 uptick in real GNP growth rate. And as shown in the following slide, this increase in economic activity is expected to have a direct impact on revenues. Next slide, please. Okay. The 2020 fiscal plan estimated that the cumulative impact on revenues resulting from the structural reforms would be approximately $24.6 billion through the next 3 decades. In the following sections, the respective teams will provide an update on the status of implementation of the structural reforms. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ricardo. And I'm not sure who's picking up next.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Ricardo previewed, the Earned Income Tax Credit is a refundable credit subject to income limitations. Earned income qualifications and varies depending on dependents claimed in a tax return for any given year. The credit is an effective anti-poverty tool, empowering beneficiaries to defray the cost of education, training, and childcare. Since its creation in 1996, the EITC program has been responsible for lifting more people out of poverty in the US than any other anti-poverty initiative. The value of the EITC is greatest when the targeted population is sufficiently knowledgeable of its value to a degree that influences daily decision-making around whether to enter the formal economy. The government has implemented an EITC adhering to the design parameters laid out in the Certified Fiscal Plan for tax years 2019 and 2020, updating tax filing forms and establishing enabling regulations to implement the program. However, the rollout of the credit has not been paired with a robust promotional campaign. The EITC outreach efforts have centered primarily around sending circular letters detailing the benefit to tax preparers and establishing a handful of outreach centers across the island to discuss EITC with potential filers. By relying extensively on an in-person outreach campaign after the tax year was over and failing to establish a more robust promotional strategy, the uptake of the program in its intended benefits have been muted. For 2020, approximately 250,000 filers claimed a total of 115 in EITC credits out of a budgetary appropriation of 203 million. Potential factors explaining the underutilization include a lack of outreach, 2015 base year estimates, and behavioral considerations. This is a great opportunity for low-income families, and we encourage the government to increase its outreach efforts to ensure full usage of the funds. The next reform is NAP work requirement. The Certified Fiscal Plan requires that the government introduce a work volunteer requirement of select adult NAP beneficiaries. The implementation of a NAP work volunteer requirement will contribute to increasing labor market participation and the potential growth anticipated from human capital and welfare reforms. The FOMB provided an additional $2.5 million through the fiscal year 2021 budget for hiring an additional 100 caseworkers to facilitate the implementation of the work volunteer requirement to the Administration for Socioeconomic Development of the Families, ATSEF for its Spanish acronym. They were able to hire 40 of those caseworkers as of January 2021, with an additional 100 to be hired using available federal funds. The recommendation is returned to the required 2-year implementation timeline rather than the delayed implementation, with fiscal year 21 being a planning year. As discussed, increasing Puerto Rico's labor participation is critical to the island's economic development. Accelerating implementation will improve the economic opportunities for Puerto Ricans. And finally, a high-quality workforce development program is designed to facilitate labor force participation, requiring that the government more effectively provide its residents with the knowledge and skills needed to contribute to the economy. Within the multiple initiatives in this section, the 2 main milestones for fiscal year 21 are the 2-stage labor analysis and the reduction of barriers to employment. For the 2-stage labor analysis, the government has completed an initial labor market analysis, which was incorporated into the Department of Economic Development's WIOA state plan. However, the analysis still needs to be provided on how the various workforce development efforts across agencies will be coordinated to address labor market needs. For the reduction of barriers to employment initiative, the Oversight Board has recommended to formalize or create a multi-agency working group to begin studying and working on the reduction of barriers such as childcare and transportation. With 57.1% of Puerto Rican children living in poverty and years of distressing natural disasters and health crisis, the Oversight Board believes the government's efforts should initially prioritize reducing employment barriers for working parents and low-income families. Thank you.
Thanks, Janorli. And I'm not sure who is this.
Karen?
Okay.
Karen?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Department of Education in Puerto Rico has faced a difficult year. In the midst of recovery efforts from Hurricane Maria and various earthquakes, the island, along with the rest of the world, was hit with the COVID-19 pandemic, forcing the department to quickly establish a distance learning program. Now PRDE is faced with the challenge of safely reopening schools after students missed up to 159 days between 2017 and 2020. This reality makes the long-term educational efforts of reform highlighted in the fiscal plan more important than ever to build a stronger, more resilient system with better outcomes for students. Even through this daunting time, the department has made some progress on fiscal plan initiatives. However, this is still a long way to go to implement reforms that will support the learning acceleration and the overall student supports needed after multiple years of disruption. In that vein, one of the main priorities of the fiscal plan is to ensure student access to education even during remote learning through the Back to School initiative. While PRDE distributed devices to all teachers and instituted a voucher program for internet services in partnership with other agencies of the Puerto Rico government, students remain without laptops as only 82% of student devices are currently registered in the system. PRDE must continue to prioritize distance learning capacities to ensure students are always connected to instructional opportunities. We have to prepare for what may and may not come in the future and keep education front and center for students and families. The Back to School Fiscal Plan initiative also requires PRDE to assess and remediate the learning gaps resulted from the last few years of missed classes and inconsistent instruction. Although PRDE has not yet formally measured these gaps, the department sees the opportunity to leverage part of the $30 million available through the UPR partnership to launch a student tutoring program. As next steps, PRDE should launch a diagnostic assessment to fully understand where learning acceleration is most needed and expand the tutoring program to best serve the needs of students. Additionally, PRDE hires school psychologists and developed an initial social emotional support plan, but leadership must continue to clarify roles for school support staff and monitor the impact that this effort will have on students' learning and social emotional well-being right now and in the future. The department needs to engage in curriculum reform to support a more structural change in its academic offerings. To date, there has been little progress given a lack of external support, although a request for proposals has been released with a provider preliminarily identified. PRDE should continue to focus on selecting a provider that fits all of its needs and include teacher and other key stakeholders in the design and implementation process. Professional development is another proven lever for supporting improved student outcomes. This year, PRDE took initial steps to leverage $30 million in funds that have accumulated over the last 3 years to use on professional development provided by UPR. The $30 million was complemented with another $1.5 million in annual funding for an English language teacher program. However, the department has yet to contract a provider to support this initiative. The Family Engagement Initiative has seen slow progress. While an initial community engagement survey was launched in the fall and programming continued during the pandemic, PRDE has not yet developed a holistic strategy that incorporates research-based practices to effectively engage families. Especially in the light of parents' increased involvement in students' education due to remote learning, there is a major opportunity for its leverage parents and the community as a resource for positive change. Now, with regards to data infrastructure, progress was focused on the critical initiative of integrating time and attendance, payroll, and human resources system to increase accountability for teacher attendance. However, the fiscal plan also calls for a data integration roadmap to improve access to high-quality data that supports decision-making. PRDE needs a strategic plan to serve as a roadmap for connecting its investments to its overall priorities, especially in light of the billions of dollars of federal funds it has received to support recovery efforts. It has started to develop a 5-year vision and related priorities based on the current state of the department. PRDE will continue pushing this effort forward with the hopes of developing a full plan by the end of April. Given the challenges of the last year, strategic planning is ever more important to align financial and human resources to address the unprecedented levels of student needs. We will continue to support PRDE in achieving the objectives of the 2020 fiscal plan. As we look to create a plan for 2021, we will refine the education reform chapter to reflect the changing needs of the department. Together, PRDE and the Oversight Board can bring necessary change to support improved outcomes and higher quality education experiences for all students of Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And I suspect Lizzie Rosso is next. I think we have ease of doing business next.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Improving the ability to do business in Puerto Rico is the utmost importance to competing for investment dollars that bring high quality jobs to the island. Puerto Rico cannot rely solely on federal and local tax incentives to attract investors. We must improve our competitiveness and attract more investment, Puerto Rican and non-Puerto Rican, because of our high quality, talented workforce. However, our weaknesses in labor regulation, in tax administration, in permitting, in property registration, in infrastructure, and in other areas weigh too heavily on our investment reputation. From bringing new investment to improving conditions so Puerto Ricans can build and grow their own businesses, the Oversight Board has focused on select number of key reforms. The permitting process has improved with the single business permit portal, and a new regulation went into effect in January, moving inspections to when the business starts operation. These changes have accelerated approval for most cases from 52 to 13 days. This is clearly a win for growing business activity on the island. In addition, the permit office hired 21 of 50 additional inspectors and is in the process of hiring 180 part-time students from the University of Puerto Rico to accelerate permit approval and to perform inspections. A comprehensive plan has been developed and is being executed that includes a re-engineering of the process, system redesign, training, metrics, and dashboards. We welcome the committee of the Department of Economic Development and designated Secretary Cedar to make this a top priority and make more rapid and more visible progress. Another key reform is registration of property. At a public board meeting about a year ago, it became clear that the backlog in property registration was about 12 years. Together with the government, we have worked to reduce the backlog, but efforts were stymied by the pandemic. More recently, by establishing performance metrics and goals and strengthening the supervision, the register increased employee productivity by 80%. This improvement resulted in a backlog reduction of 98,000 cases. In 2020, documents were registered in 72 days, which is 118 days less than in the last World Bank survey. In addition, the Permits Office has developed a comprehensive plan to eliminate backlog. We commend the government for these substantial improvements and look forward to collaborating further to continue improving these metrics. Registration of the property is a key element of doing business, and the ease of doing so will either encourage investment in real estate and development or discourage it if it's not meeting the needs of investors as compared to other investment destinations. On island freight, the regulation of land freight is important to the island economy because it will reduce transportation costs, which are passed on to consumers. No one argues that regulation regarding safety and environment are necessary. However, the outdated tariff regulations in Puerto Rico affect business and residents. On the mainland, this type of regulation has been eliminated in the 8 contiguous states and showed that cost of products were reduced. Instead of deregulating tariffs in Puerto Rico, like in the mainland, the Transportation and Other Service Bureau has recently increased freight tariffs by 35% in December. raising not only the cost of doing business in Puerto Rico, but the ultimate cost of goods purchased by Puerto Rican consumers. The Treasury Department has made some progress in reducing the administrative burden of tax filers, such as the digitizing of the corporate income tax filing, implementation of an online appointment system for claims, and the capacity to send secure documents online for claims resolution. However, there is a great deal more to do. The next step is to develop a comprehensive tax administration reform plan and reduce tax filings, including the municipal inventory and property taxes, among others. Puerto Rico requires 180 licenses for all kinds of occupations, unlike most of other states and countries. The licensing is a barrier to employment and complicates entry into the formal workforce. It results in people working in the informal market to avoid the bureaucracy and costs required by the licensing regime. As a result, these individuals don't get to benefit of Social Security or other protections, while the government doesn't receive its share of income tax. There has been very little progress in reforming this overwhelming and costly licensing system, which requires streamlining, simplification, consolidation, and elimination. A task force composed of 2 UPR professors, 20 students, the Department of State, Department of Health, and the Institute of Liberty will compare the 180 licenses in Puerto Rico to those of the states and will make recommendations on licenses to streamline, align rules with the states, and to join interstate licensing compacts. Invest Puerto Rico developed the structure and the plans to promote Puerto Rico as an investment destination, to bring new investment to the island, and to take advantage of the U.S. Department of Transportation waiver for a transshipment cargo air hub. Invest Puerto Rico reports that 88% of the cases they managed to attract or retain investors were successful. However, Invest Puerto Rico also reports it exceeded its job creation goals by 22% and capital investment goals by 21%. Discover Puerto Rico contributed to a successful recovery of the island tourism after the 2017 hurricanes, and now faces a Herculean effort to do so again after COVID-19. DPR is focused on communicating Puerto Rico's advantages as a destiny to meeting and convention planners and strengthening their promotion through social media and internet channels. Efforts are expected to increase tourism revenues once consumers start feeling safe to travel. According to Discover Puerto Rico, in 2020, Discover's marketing influenced $1.48 billion in direct economic impact of leisure travel to the island. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Lizzie. And Natalie, are you taking the power reform? Great, thank you.
Unfortunately, our infrastructure director, Alejandro Figueroa, is unable to join us today, so I'll try and step in. Power sector is the cornerstone of Puerto Rico's economic development. The cost and reliability of electricity is one of the most important aspects that potential investors look at when considering where to set up operations. But even more importantly, each resident of the island deserves reliable, affordable, and clean energy. And that is why this reform has been a priority for the Oversight Board and the government, and it is so critical to the development of life and the economy on the island, as well as to the potential of exiting bankruptcy of Prepa. The power sector structural reform is based on achieving the following. 1, a strong independent regulator. 2, professionally managed transmission and distribution system, T&D. 3, a professionally managed generation system. 4, maximizing the effect of federal funding. And 5, restructuring legacy debt and pension obligations. The government has made strong progress in establishing that independent regulator, the first issue. PREB, the Puerto Rico Energy Bureaus, budget has been increased from 5.6 to $20 million per year, and additional safeguards have been put in place to protect PREB's decisions from political influence. Example of those safeguards include staggered terms for members and members being selected based on experience from a candidate list prepared by a recruitment firm. Now, PREB must use this increased budget to build up its capabilities and resources and staff up with experienced, knowledgeable, and professional career employees. The 2020 Certified Fiscal Plan requires PREB to reduce the amount of trust employees to no more than 15% of its total workforce by the end of this fiscal year, June 30th, 2021, and 10% by the end of the next fiscal year. Again, the sole purpose to ensure professionalism and avoid politicization. On the second item, significant progress has also been made on transferring the transmission and distribution operations to a professional private operator through the careful selection of LUMA. The selection of LUMA was a result of a thorough, comprehensive, and competitive process in which various world-class utility companies participated. LUMA brings with it immeasurable knowledge and experience which will be put to use to improve the energy system, to improve customer service, and to operate it in a way that customers experience fewer and shorter outages. No one could argue today that they've received the customer service, the electricity reliability, or the post-natural disaster recovery from Prepa that they expected or deserved. It is time for us to make this change and deliver to our customers what they pay for and expect. As it progresses through its front-end transition, LUMA is expected to take over these responsibilities by June 1st, 2021. Ahead of this date, there are several actions that Prepa and PREB must take. Among them, Prepa must implement its reorganization into separate entities, one for generation, GenCo, and one for T&D, GridCo. It's important to note that this split into separate entities is a direct and express mandate of the Commonwealth's Energy Policy, Act 17 of 2019, which directly prohibits Prepa's continued monopoly over both generation and distribution operations. PREB, the regulator, must review and approve LUMA's regulatory filings, which includes initial budgets, system remediation plans, performance metrics, system operating principles, all of which would then provide the objectives LUMA will need to pursue and the manner in which performance of LUMA going forward will be assessed. In the next area of generation, progress has been made in transferring operation of Prepa's existing generation assets to one or more private operators. After a thorough analysis of their qualifications, the Public-Private Partnership Authority, the P3 Authority, selected 8 potential proponents in August of 2020. And the request for proposals was published on November 10th, 2020, shared with 8 qualified proponents. While there have been some delays in this process, we should have been selecting the proponents already in April of this year. The government can make up the lost time by working towards avoiding any further delays and selecting one or more proponents by the first quarter of the next fiscal year. The process I referred to is for management of existing generation assets of Prepa. It's important to note here that the Oversight Board supports and encourages the RFP process for new alternative renewable energy generation that is underway with Prepa and that this is to be developed by the private sector in accordance with Puerto Rico public policy and Puerto Rico law. The next element of this transformation is maximizing federal funds. It is an equally important objective given that the rebuilding of the system since the devastating hurricanes has not really begun in earnest as of yet. No less than $10.7 billion worth of federal investments are expected to be made into the energy system over the next 10 to 15 years, of which 9.7 are to be financed by FEMA. An additional 1.9 billion on top of the 10.7 of CDBG-DR funding should become available in the near future. Out of that initial 10.7 billion, approximately 9.7 are destined for the distribution assets, while the remaining 1 billion is destined for generation and water reservoir assets. One of LUMA's main responsibilities is to ensure that those funds, when targeted at the transmission and distribution system, are deployed on time, on budget, in accordance with Puerto Rico law, and in accordance with federal law. To that end, they've developed a system remediation plan. which provides a roadmap for investing those funds to improve and strengthen Puerto Rico's energy system. As to the other $1 billion that are for the generation and water assets in the system, Prepa has developed a 10-year plan to invest those funds. Finally, it's important to note that Prepa remains in bankruptcy, and exiting bankruptcy must be a near-term goal. Without restructuring the legacy debt and pension costs, in other words, if we had to pay the existing legacy debt in full, and if we have to pay the full pension costs, given the lack of previous contributions to that pension system and the state that it's in, Prepa's rates would need to increase by 8 to 9 cents per kilowatt hour to fully fund Prepa's existing debt service and its existing pension liabilities. Only through debt restructuring and pension reform can that incremental cost of 8 to 9 cents per kilowatt hour to every single person's bill can be reduced. And so we need to get through the restructuring of the legacy obligations and debt. Moving on to the last area of structural reforms in the certified fiscal plan, infrastructure. Investments in transportation infrastructure are critical for supporting economic activity broadly and ensuring citizens have access to safe and efficient government and public services. Think about how many hours are wasted in traffic, how much pollution is created by that traffic. How well does our public transportation system work together in San Juan for those of us who have no cars? Historically, however, Puerto Rico has lagged most US states, both in the quality of its infrastructure and the level of dollars invested in maintaining and improving that infrastructure. To that end, the 2020 Certified Fiscal Plan called for the government to improve delivery of its capital programs initiatives aimed at improving efficiency and effectiveness of transportation planning and capital improvement projects. Equally important to promoting that economic activity and accessibility is the integration of transit assets, as I mentioned, in particular here in San Juan. But also the buses, the ferries, each of them being operated independently leads to poor service quality, reliability, and it forces residents to opt for personal vehicles as a mode of transportation rather than public transport. Progress has been slow and significant uncertainty remains around many of the key milestones in the certified fiscal plan here. In conclusion, we want to say that we welcome the government's commitment and the various designated secretaries and agency and public corporation heads to work towards the shared vision of a prosperous, vibrant Puerto Rico and implementation of these important economic growth platforms, which can enable Puerto Rico to best compete for human talent, for investment dollars, for new jobs, and not only to reduce the migration off the island, but to encourage people to come home. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Natalie, and thanks also Ricardo, Janorli, Karen, and Lizzie for those presentations and that update. We've covered a lot of ground in this discussion, number of different topics. Are there any questions or comments on these or related matters? I see the governor has a question or comment, Betty and Andrew. So starting with the governor and Antonio.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you're right. This was a very comprehensive presentation. And I will react or respond to some of recommendations. I'll react to some of the recommendations and comments that Natalie and your staff made. First, EITC. I fully believe that we should have a robust promotional campaign to ensure that taxpayers in Puerto Rico take advantage of the existing EITC program we have, as well as the expanded EITC program we will have with the additional federal funds coming our way. So I will be talking to our Secretary of the Treasury, Francisco Pares, to make sure that we have the necessary funding to conduct this campaign right away for the upcoming tax filings within this same tax year. And I will also double check that for the next year's budget, we have the necessary funding there. If we need to submit a reprogramming request, we will, but we will act with a sense of urgency because I agree, we want taxpayers to use this program as provided. The second thing I'll mention is that I am fully committed to implementing the work volunteering requirement in our nutrition assistance program. I have already advised the Secretary of the Department of Family Affairs that that's my position. I have advised the head of ATSEF as well. I have told them that I want this 2-year implementation to happen. So count on that. I have said specifically that I want this requirement to start being implemented in the next fiscal year 22. So I'll make sure that we do that. Education, the presentation was excellent, but I have to say a couple of things. First, this 5-year strategic plan is absolutely essential. I agree. And it is so important that I am going to have a full-time a staff member at La Fortaleza working full-time, overseeing the Department of Education and providing technical support to the Department of Education to ensure that that 5-year plan has all the necessary components and so that we maximize all the federal funding we have as well as our own. I have talked to Omar Marrero about this. I know our fiscal agency has several staff members assisting the Department of Education, but we're going to roll up our sleeves and make sure that there's execution there like we haven't seen in so long. Now, it is particularly troubling to me that there is a funding available for the English teacher training program, and that a provider has not yet selected or is about to be selected. So that's an area that we definitely need to work on, because the teaching of English is absolutely essential in Puerto Rico. We need to improve it. We need our population to be really bilingual. This is good for our population at large and definitely for our future. The diagnostic assessment that is being mentioned because of the impact of the pandemic is also critical. So I need to ensure that that's happening. One thing though that I'm going to ask the board, both in terms of this 5-year plan as well as in terms of the fiscal plan, we need to, as I have said before, we need to expand the number of specialized schools we have in our system. They work. They're as good or better than private schools. And I'm talking about bilingual schools. I'm talking about STEM schools, among others. We need to increase the number of Montessori schools we have in the system. It's proven. They work, they improve school dropouts. They handle that very well. And vocational schools. We need to increase the number of vocational schools. Or, you know, our children, our students, they should not all go to, you know, universities for, you know, math, science, history, what have you. We need to make sure that we train them for good, able jobs we have, for good jobs, good paying jobs we have in Puerto Rico, and will continue to have, particularly in the construction sector, as we use all this federal funding that is coming our way. We need to extend school hours. It is proven that children perform better if they stay longer in the schools. And once this pandemic is behind us, we need to do that. That's why I am proposing to bring back some of the retired teachers we have, so many of them, who could come back and work on a part-time basis without affecting their pensions. So, you know, we need to incorporate concepts like those both in the fiscal plan as well as the 5-year strategic plan if we really want schools to do better in Puerto Rico. I am glad that you addressed and dealt with Discover Puerto Rico. Tourism is going to come back. I have no doubt. It's going to come back when this pandemic is behind us. We will definitely reach that herd immunity by the summer. I anticipate by end of the summer for sure. And we're seeing already how many tourists are coming. Some of them are not behaving as we want them to, and we're dealing with that. But I see a strong rebound from our tourism sector. But we do need to ensure that Discover Puerto Rico is adequately funded. So let's make sure that both for fiscal plan purposes as well as budgeting purposes for next year, we increase that budget. When you look at what Puerto Rico spends for promotional efforts, for marketing efforts, and compare it to what the Dominican Republic spends and the Bahamas spends, we lag behind. So we need to deal with that. I am glad as well, and this is the last topic I will deal with, that Natalie Jaresco addressed the energy sector. There's so much misinformation out there, so much unnecessary politicization out there dealing with this LUMA contract and the transformation that is underway that is appalling. It's appalling. We just need to keep reminding people what happened after Maria. Prepa's response to Maria was disastrous. People without power for a whole year. The lack of professionalization in Prepa is obvious. Both, we do need professional management of the transmission and distribution of energy in Puerto Rico. We do need professional management of our generation capacity in Puerto Rico. We do need Rico and GenCo. And we need to oversee that happens. And I know that now everybody's trying to criticize the P3 contract with LUMA, and they're talking about ways in which perhaps we could improve upon it. But people in Puerto Rico need to realize that Puerto Rico it's a place of law and order. And administrations may change, but government remains. And the government needs to honor its contracts. And this particular contract went through a whole process involving the P3 authority, Prepa itself, the oversight board, and the Energy Bureau. And people forget that the Energy Bureau we have now, we didn't have in the past. And one of the tasks that Energy Bureau has is to impose metrics on LUMA and oversee LUMA and make sure LUMA does everything it has to do so that, yes, we have reliable, affordable, and cleaner energy for our people, for our businesses and our residents. It's about time that we start saying the right things about this. And I will do my part, and I'm glad that the board is doing its part. And now we need to make sure that the Energy Bureau does its part as well. That's why we have an energy regulator, to make sure LUMA does what it needs to do, and Prepa as well. And Prepa should better start organizing both GridCo and GenCo, and finalizing the RFP that is, and the P3 authority finalizing the RFP that is on its way, so that we have new sources of energy in Puerto Rico, particularly renewable energy, clean energy, as we need. So I thank the board for addressing this topic. I hope that we start getting the right information out there in the public domain, because again, I see too much disinformation, too much politicization, and we need to transform the energy sector for the benefit of Puerto Rico as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. And let me say, I want to thank you for your commitment in each of these areas. And I particularly want to just reinforce your comments about the energy transformation. LUMA and the transformation are absolutely essential to the island. I mean, that's the starting point of the economy taking off. Once again, reliable, affordable electricity. So thank you very much for your continued commitment in that area in particular and the other areas as well. I have questions or comments from Betty, Andrew, and Antonio. So Betty?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First and foremost, I want to thank you, Governor, for highlighting and emphasizing the issue on education and your response to it. But first and foremost, I want to say that all of these structural reforms are critical to the island. These are positive impacts on the economy, particularly to lift people out of poverty. And so you spoke to the issue of education, which is obviously my area. All of these are of interest, but my area of interest obviously is education. And some people may ask why a highly educated workforce increases economic growth. And my response is that education is truly one of the most powerful instruments for reducing poverty. And we all know that it sets the foundation for sustaining economic growth. So those two are very much interconnected, and they intersect in a way that at no point should they be disconnected, as they say. And finally, I truly believe that, as you stated, and as we have talked about, that there is a call for investment in education in order to make Puerto Rico more competitive. So I stand to serve. I do want to make sure that we understand that all these structural reforms are extremely critical to the island and to a positive impact on its economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. Andrew?
Well, thanks very much. And I would echo what my colleague Betty Rosa just said of how important all of these structural reforms are. And if you look at, I think the first chart in the presentation, it shows that in any given year and any given reform, the effects on economic growth are not huge. But when you put them together and you look at them over a longer period of time, enacting these structural reforms is the difference between a Puerto Rico that converges with the rest of the United States in terms of incomes and one that doesn't. It's the difference between a Puerto Rico that dramatically reduces poverty and raises incomes there and one that doesn't. It's gratifying to see, some of the green signs on the right-hand side of the chart showing that we're making real progress in these areas, but there's also a lot of yellow and a lot of red there. And I think the thing to remember in this is that some of these are fairly easy reforms to do, but other areas are long-standing problems that we've all been aware of, certainly for the entire time I've been on the board, and people from Puerto Rico obviously know them well beforehand. When you have long-standing problems, what it shows is these are very, very difficult problems to solve. They are problems that are going to involve and require the full engagement of the government, whether it's the administration or the legislature, saying, what do we really need to do to once and for all fix these problems so that Puerto Rico can move ahead? So I'm happy to see what we have accomplished so far and what the government's accomplished. But I really want to stress the importance of engaging on these things and recognizing that they're going to be difficult problems to solve, but making the necessary commitment to do that.
Thank you, Andrew. Antonio?
Yes, good morning to everybody. I want to take advantage of the fact that most of you spoke already, and I think this highlights that we are all on the same page. In order to grow the economy, we need to address these structural changes, and we need to do it with urgency. Out of the presentation, I have to say that one of the most important numbers that was presented is that our competitiveness has, or ease of doing business factor has gone from the 20s down to the 60s. And what's interesting is that number, it's really in government's hands. It's our ability to deploy programs and processes that make it easy to do business in the island. And unfortunately, what we have seen over the last 20, 30 years is that every year we continue to fall. So I think we need to make a concerted effort to turn around the ship, to really start driving some of these changes at the agency level to ensure that we have a better business environment such that we can start growing our economy. Now, on very specific items, I think that many of the important areas were mentioned here, but there are other critical areas. The ERP is one of them that I think would be of great benefit to the island, and the processing of data. And there are multiple others in the fiscal plan. So I encourage everybody in the group to look together at how can we make sure that the budget includes those actual changes in the way we operate our government. Specific comments, I think as a group, we must ensure that the LUMA contract is properly executed, that they have the best possible environment. If there are improvements, I'm sure, as with everything, we can always improve the process, but ensuring that we implement the LUMA contract in a timely manner and an efficient way is critical to the success of Puerto Rico as a whole, so we can finally see a change in direction for our energy production and energy sources. I think, Betty, I echo your words. Education is critical. We cannot have a growing economy and a positive environment for economic development if we not have the right education for our children. We've talked about this before. So we need to work together with the University of Puerto Rico and Department of Education. I think Betty and I have talked about this. So we, Governor, we are able or available to you to help to resolve some of perhaps the differences there's been in the past between the board and some of these areas. I specifically met with the president of the university, and I know you were aware of that meeting. So we're certainly willing to help you, and we'll be very active in that regard. Two areas, absolutely, sir. Two areas that we really need to work together to also make work are Discover Puerto Rico and Invest Puerto Rico. These are tremendous tools for development for the island, both in the tourism industry and industrial sectors. And we need to make sure they're adequately funded, and we need to make sure that they work properly and they're well integrated with the Economic Development Administration. So I want to continuously pursue how do we best utilize those tools to drive growth in the island. Now, I do have a comment about a specific item that was raised. There's been, and I think Lizzie Ross is the one that presented it, there's been a recent increase in the on-island freight. And I'm looking actually at the chart, and it's about a 35% increase in the price of transportation, which leads to about $1 billion or close to $1 billion of incremental expenses. If anybody lives in the island knows, if you go to the grocery store here versus the grocery store in Florida or New York or anywhere else in the States, the prices for goods are significantly higher in Puerto Rico. And of course, we have to import many of those items. And also in terms of construction costs, in terms of industrial costs for production, there are significant costs already in place due to transportation. Now, in the presentation, we talked about how do we repeal the order? And I don't know how to go about that, but I want to make a call to the group to say that increase really goes against the competitiveness of the island. And maybe it's the governor, I don't know, actually, the process, I've seen it in the newspapers, is being, there's a lot of debate on this. I think the PRMA and the Chamber of Commerce are directly against it. I'm sure that there was some good thinking behind it. I'm not sure of the implementation, but a 35% increase in freight costs, it's really something that I don't think the island can afford. And I want to raise that as an area of opportunity that we need to look at coming out of this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. Are there any other questions or comments about any of the discussion? Justin?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would agree with what my colleague said about the importance of these reforms, and also thank the governor for his leadership and his commitment in this area. I just want to specifically underscore the importance when it comes in the power sector of LUMA. You know, we've got this June 1 deadline, and that's a real deadline. And there's a lot of work to do before then. And I want to underscore the importance of LUMA reaching out to Prepa employees and coming up with a plan so that we can transition these employees. I think a lot of them are wondering what their future is. And so I think that's an area we've got to focus on. But I think all in all, I agree with the comments of my colleagues, and I want to thank the governor for his commitment to these things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Justin. Any other questions or comments? Great. Thank everybody. And we'll now turn to public comments. And so I'll turn things back over to Natalie Jaresko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First set of questions are on Prepa. Jeffrey Team asks, he asks Ms. Jaresko and Governor Puerto, can you please speak to the progress on the Prepa RSA? The delayed implementation date is March 31st, and beginning in April, Prepa will be subject to increased settlement payments. Mr. Governor, do you believe there is the political willpower to pass the required legislation to fulfill the RSA conditions, namely the transition charge? I'll take a stab at answering this, and then Governor, if you want to add, please. Just to make everyone clear, when the Oversight Board, the government, and Prepa presented the restructuring plan for Prepa's debt, we firmly believe that we had the best plan possible under the circumstances to take Prepa out of bankruptcy and move forward with this important element of the transformation of the energy system. But then COVID happened, and it changed the world, it changed Puerto Rico, and with it, our assumptions have changed for Puerto Rico, and Prepa have also changed. And so the Oversight Board has asked the court to halt the restructuring process and assess the effects while we assess the effects of the pandemic on the island. We've been reevaluating that agreement. We've been talking to creditors, and as I noted earlier, we are very focused on trying to get Prepa out of bankruptcy as soon as reasonably possible, but we don't have an announcement yet to make on the RSA. Governor, do you want to add anything, or?
Yeah, I'll be brief. Actually, I believe the board needs to revisit the RSA. I also believe that the board should be submitting a plan of Prepa, the sooner the better. I am confident that the board will be able to obtain the support of a critical mass of creditors, a substantial number of creditors, of Prepa's creditors, when the time comes. I do believe that the restructuring, the plan of adjustment will include a transition charge, but what people are not realizing, or some are not realizing, is the impact of the transformation of Prepa that is underway and that we need to ensure it happens. I am talking about efficiencies that we need to obtain at Prepa, both on the transmission and distribution side of its equation, as well as on the generation side. We need to obviously rely ever more so on renewable sources, fix our cost of energy in Puerto Rico like we haven't for the most part in the past, stop relying so much on fossil fuels and being subject to market fluctuations, and all of that can be done. So the transition charge will be offset by those savings that we definitely can obtain and achieve once we do the transformation we need to do in Prepa. So I have told the board as well that I do not support any kind of sun tax or anything resembling that, and that's my position. Whether the legislature will approve it or not, I think the legislature will have no choice, because what this restructuring will do when the time comes is reduce the cost of energy in Puerto Rico. Because it'll definitely provide for an adequate or a sustainable debt service for Prepa, and it'll allow Prepa to go forward and by the way, and allow the transformation that needs to happen, which is the creation of Rico, Genco that I mentioned before, and so on. So yes, I am confident that when the dust settles, there will be consensus. Not unanimity, because that's impossible, but a majority of the sensible members of the legislatures, reasonable members of the legislatures will definitely support the plan of adjustment down the road. That's my expectation.
Thank you, Mr. Governor. The second question on Prepa from F.L. Horn. In my research of the most recent restructured Prepa bonds, the leading bond rating agency rated those bonds in common language as, quote, imminent default, unquote. What does the board plan to do when Prepa enters imminent default, and how does this affect LUMA? Well, actually, Prepa's bonds have been in default since July 2017, when Prepa filed Title III. No interest or other debt service payments have been made on the bonds since the filing. And the bonds will be restructured as part of the Title III process, much of as the governor has just described, pursuant to a plan of adjustment. In terms of LUMA, they are aware that Prepa's in Title III, and they are aware that Prepa needs to restructure its bonds. LUMA intends to assume full service under the operation and maintenance agreement on June 1, prior to any plan confirmation, while Prepa's restructuring efforts will be ongoing. Next question is on retirement and retirement systems and Law 80. Iris M. Salas Fede, when do you expect to give the endorsement for Law 80 on incentivized retirement? We understand the situation, but we hope they understand our situation. So I want to repeat, as I have in previous board meetings, that we have listened and we continue to hear from many retirees with regard to their concerns in person, in email, through social media. We understand the worries that retirees have and their hopes for this law, Law 80. But let me stress again what I've had to say before. Every law has to be based on solid analysis of its effects and its costs. Many past governments have not done so, and instead they added services, they added benefits to retirement without being able to afford it, and then didn't fund it, and today those pension systems are insolvent. Puerto Rico also ended up with budget deficits because they weren't able to afford the benefits that they were promising. So right now, with regard to Law 80, 81, and 82, the government is analyzing the complete costs for the laws and where the funding would come from to fund those, and we await that analysis from the government. The next question, also on retirement, from Carmen Santiago. Good morning. For record purposes and for the record, my name is Carmen L. Santiago Colon, former student and pensioner of the University of Puerto Rico Ponce campus. I live in Newburgh, New York. Today, more than questions, what I want to do is make clear that as a UPR pensioner, I reiterate my constant opposition to any change imposed or proposed to our UPR retirement system, to our pensions, or actions by you or by any other body that attempts against the permanence of our retirement system. It is not possible to pretend to make changes when the irresponsibility of the university administration is evident due to its laziness, lag, and lack of will when it comes to addressing important claims for institutional stability. There will be no distance which prevents me from showing my rejection and opposition to any action that capriciously attempts against the stability of the retirement system and any of us, the fiduciaries. I was retiring in October 2020 at 61 years of age, and I only received 35%. I am waiting for the approval of Law 80 because the percentage is 50%. My knees are sick. Please, I want to know whether or not Law 80 will be approved so I can make a decision. Carmen, thank you again. I won't repeat what I've said on Law 80, but I will say that it's important for you to know that without taking action, specifically without reforming the University of Puerto Rico pension system or fully funding the required contributions, which up until last year were not being fully funded, the University of Puerto Rico retirement system faces insolvency by the 2030s. So no one wishes to deprive anyone of their retirement benefits, and no one wishes to make this the problem of retirees. But something has to happen in order for the UPR pension system to remain solvent so you can continue to receive the pension benefit you receive today. Every month that UPR doesn't implement measures to fix that pension plan, the fiscal plan estimates the cost is an increased $7.5 million required in employer contributions. So the university needs to make a decision. Either they are going to fully fund it and take resources away from current education towards the retirement system, or they are going to reform it somewhat in line with the reform that is occurring in the other retirement systems on the island to ensure that you don't lose what you're getting today, that they do not end up in insolvency, unable to pay any pensions at some point. Next question is on municipalities from Jeffrey Teen. What has the FOMB done to help the island's 78 municipalities access capital since declaring them covered entities? Can you please speak to why the two main on-island banks have stopped extending additional funds to the municipalities, and if the FOMB has approached the FDIC about regulatory relief? What progress has been made on the Treasury's plan to improve property tax collections on the island? So first of all, our role is in terms of improving access to capital markets is multiple. First, we have a pilot project with 10 municipalities where we are trying to work with them to devise ways to make the municipalities actually economically stronger, fiscally more capable of getting more market access. A lot of that depends on consolidation of back office and savings on the back office costs. The other part of it is our work with CRIM to, as you mentioned, improve property tax collection on the island. And the measures that are in the CRIM fiscal plan are slated to kick in gradually as multi-year efforts. So we should start to see better results on collections over the next few years. Some of them began in this fiscal year, others you'll see improvements more quickly, compliance, enhanced collections. The measures, for example, on correcting mailing addresses has resulted already in approximately $17 million of incremental revenue to date. So some of these property tax collection measures are happening, more to come. But that is the work that we're doing with CRIM. Finally, to go back to municipalities, we review and approve the requests for credit facilities submitted by municipalities subject to Section 207. And to the extent that municipalities can demonstrate financial soundness to banks, the private entities, we review them and their repayment capability and approve them. The board cannot speak for the banking industry and their process in terms of decision-making, their credit extension policies. And no, we have not approached the FDIC seeking regulatory relief for the municipalities. Javier Hernandez has a question on status. Has the FOMB ever, or would it be interested to consider the possibility that a sovereign Puerto Rico would be able to generate billions more in revenues than the current Commonwealth? If a sovereign Puerto Rico was able to pay bondholders, would the board be interested in learning more about these economic projections? If so, let me know. Thank you, Javier. The question of Puerto Rico's political status is up to the people of Puerto Rico to decide. And PROMESA specifically states that it cannot restrict, the board cannot restrict Puerto Rico's right to determine its future political status. That's why the Oversight Board does not take a position on status. Mr. Gonzalez asks about procurement. Who is going to review all contracts and all overpriced auction contracts that may be given to a friend of the political party when they use a state of emergency as an excuse to do so? So first of all, Section 204 provides the Oversight Board the authority to review all contracts for their consistency with the fiscal plan and the competitive process in which they have been procured. But it's important for everyone to note that last November, we announced that we had reached agreement with the General Services Administration, the GSA, on a new regulation. That new regulation was critically important specifically because it brought transparency to what was previously a very opaque process of procurement during emergencies under executive orders and other. So what we did with that regulation, and that regulation is in place and operating now, it strengthens transparency. It establishes uniform, robust, sound procedures. Specifically, there's a section on exceptional purchases, purchases during these periods of emergency. There were requirements that were added that must be met before any exceptional purchase can be made to ensure that they're necessary purchases and that they're documented. Everyone knows about the emergency purchases of Prepa after the hurricanes, of certain COVID-related products after the declaration of the COVID pandemic. And these regulations were meant to put in place a process that would avoid that ever happening again. For example, there have to be 2 responsible officials of an agency requesting the purchase. It can't be a figment of someone's imagination or happen by text message. It needs to be documented, and there need to be 2 officials that sign a justification explaining why the purchase cannot happen through traditional, normal, competitive mechanisms. There's also ways to define process in the regulation for exceptional purchases in cases of emergencies declared by the governor. Previously, those purchases were processed without procedures. That's not the case anymore under the new regulation. There are audits of exceptional purchases. There's an open book format for these exceptional purchases. There are specific periods necessary to carry out these and more. So I assure you that, and I'm sure the governor will confirm, the new regulation is in place and the emergency purchases will be made in accordance with the new regulation. I have a question from Leonard Katzer. Every American has the right to request investigation and help from the U.S. Department of Justice. You continually state that an extreme number of departments, agencies, and sub-agencies refuse to provide financial data for the outside audit, for the financial audited statements. Why not request the U.S. Department of Justice to investigate the head of each of these departments and any related individuals in these departments for misappropriation of public funds, fraud, or multiple other criminal acts? After the first few are indicted and thrown into the Crossbar Motel, don't you believe there would be a flood of information from remaining department heads to provide the information you requested them? So with regard to the audited financial statements in particular, we have worked very closely with the government and urged the government to issue rules and regulations that would allow the government to implement disciplinary procedures and fines for those agency heads that do not deliver their financial audited statements on time. And those processes have been put in place by the new Secretary of Hacienda, Secretary Perez, and we expect that they will be used in the future if there is continued delays. In terms of any irregularities that you described, fraud, misappropriation, criminal acts, we on a regular basis refer any such evidence of irregularity to the law enforcement agencies of the federal government. And we did that when, as you remember, municipalities and government agencies were not making a timely transfer of the employee contribution towards the retirement plan. We immediately let the Department of Justice know, and there have been other cases like that as well. Mr. Gonzalez asks, what position does the FOMB maintain when they give contracts or provident funds that are being used to destroy nature? Does anyone in the FOMB study the many videos and photos of deforestation with FEMA funds and other funds used by Puerto Rico departments? I will admit, Mr. Gonzalez, that is not in our mandate. That is not an area where we have any authority or any mandate in the law. We're not a law enforcement agency, and we encourage anyone that knows about the irregularities that you're suggesting to immediately inform law enforcement. Our contract review process is not designed to uncover environmental issues. It's only allowed to focus on, under law, the consistency in the fiscal plan and market competition. And I believe that's all we have for today.
Thank you, Natalie. And I think that's just about all we have for the meeting today as well. Are there any other matters that we should raise and bring up? I don't hear any. I will make a motion that we adjourn this meeting. Will somebody second that motion?
Second.
Thank you, Andrew. It's always the most popular motion of the meeting. I'll take a voice vote as always. All in favor, say yes.
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 Any opposed, say no. Any abstentions? The motion carries, so the meeting is adjourned. As always, we'll have a press conference immediately following exiting this meeting. Thanks everybody for a very productive meeting, and once again, Governor, we greatly appreciate you being with us in person and the comments that you made. So thanks everybody.